To start with, Dr. Long, what is near-death experience? How would you sum that up in a nutshell?
Sure. Near-death experience is defined exactly as the phrase implies. You're near death. In other words, you're so physically compromised that you're unconscious or maybe clinically dead with no measurable heartbeat. So at that time, when you're unconscious and shouldn't have any lucid memory at that time, you do. And that's the experience part of the near-death experience.
One thing I know that many people are interested in hearing about is where people encounter relatives, where they encounter a loved one during their near-death experience. Can you relate one such experience, Dr. Long?
Sure. Well, they're not rare. About 20% of people that have a near-death experience will encounter deceased loved ones. The majority of the time, they're relatives. They can be, however, friends, spouses even. And interestingly, we have a fairly good-sized series of encountering deceased beloved pets. But when they encounter these deceased loved ones, even if that loved one died of very advanced age or a disfiguring accident or illness, when they're encountered, and that's generally, again, in this unearthly or heavenly realm, when they are reunited, these are joyous reunions. There's a lot of interaction, and the person that died in their earthly life appears essentially always picture-perfect health. We've had several that lost a limb, leg, or an arm in earthly life. When they appear in the near-death experience, all 4 limbs are intact. So a remarkable evidence of healing. So in fact, interestingly, if they died at a very, very advanced age, they may literally appear decades younger when they are encountered in the near-death experience. And we have some uncommon times where the person encountered in the near-death experience died in early infancy, and they may appear a few years older as middle to older childhood. So picture perfect health, joyous reunions, lots of communication, lots of sharing, very inspiring to the near-death experiencer who may have worried, what happened to my loved one when they died? Are they okay? Well, the near-death experience vividly answering that, yes, absolutely they're okay in that beautiful, unearthly, heavenly realm. In fact, they're far more okay, those that have died and gone on, than those of us slogging through our often difficult earthly lives.
You mentioned some have experiences of their pets. Do you have an example of that?
Sure. Just one, gosh, there's so many. Okay, just one out of many. There was a lady who had a beloved pet horse and had to put the horse down because the horse was ill and was going to die anyway. And so she was just racked with guilt because the horse was her best friend. So she had a near-death experience, and literally the horse appeared, and there was communication, and the horse and her communicating was able to remove all guilt she had. The horse said, "I know that I was dying. It's okay." And there's no need to feel any guilt or sorrow about that. The horse was able, of course, was in an unearthly heavenly realm. And so you can just imagine how tremendously reassuring that was to this person, understanding that their horse, didn't even have to forgive her because there's nothing to forgive. I mean, there's no reason to have any guilt or resentment. And the horse being in that beautiful unearthly realm. So again, hugely inspirational to the person that had that near-death experience, had that awareness, able to go on living the rest of her life without that guilt or those difficult emotional reactions that had haunted her up until that time.
Yeah, that must have been incredibly reassuring. Mm-hmm. And I know that it's also, I don't know if it's common, perhaps you could shed some light on what proportion of people have this kind of experience where they encounter a being that they identify as God or some divine being, something of that nature.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've actually studied that and written a book about that. So I was so fascinated as my years of research went on. Over and over, I would see people encountering, and the best human word that they could use is God. So as we get into this discussion, I would emphasize that many near-death experiencers say that during their near-death experience, while the best word they have is God, no earthly word can possibly describe that being they met that had the beauty, the overwhelming love of all that they were, that overwhelming intelligence, that awareness of being a creator. They say these are earthly words that you try to use to describe something that is far beyond earthly language. But again, God is the best term we have, so we'll go with that. When people encounter God, and again, this is typically in that, obviously in that unearthly or heavenly realm, don't forget, this is, when we keep talking about that heavenly realm, it is not a geographically separate three-dimensional physical world like we know here. So laying down some foundational concepts, in that afterlife, it is non-physical. Communication is non-physical. It's not like we're talking here. It's essentially always telepathic, thought to thought, but beyond that, instantaneous communication of all concepts, context behind it, emotions behind it. It's like far beyond what you would consider telepathic. Movement is non-physical. You don't walk like you hear on Earth. Movement can be very rapid, very slow, but it's non-physical. Time in the afterlife realm is either described as radically, almost invariably in near-death experience accounts, it's either radically different than we know in our earthly life or simply doesn't exist. So we have that going on too. So when we talk about this, be aware that it's literally a non-physical realm, this afterlife realm, that is completely different from everything we've known in our physical, earthly, everyday life.
When you say that the time ceases to exist, how does a person experience that?
Right. It's very common for people. Well, we've talked very briefly about that life review or encountering part or all of their prior life during their near-death experience. Just as an example of how rapid acceleration of consciousness can be and how time doesn't exist there, people can be aware of all certainly even all of their prior life, and that's not at all unusual, about 15 to 20%. And during a near-death experience, they may review decades of their prior life, and they may be aware of literally every single event. Well, that would take decades in normal physical earthly life, and yet here in the afterlife where time doesn't exist, they can be aware of all that. They can be aware of how their life played out. They can form opinions about that in the literal minutes that they're unconscious or clinically dead. So that's a fairly vivid example of how timelessness it is over there. But near-death experiencers may have a great deal of experience, interaction, basically playing out that near-death experience, which would be days, weeks, even months of their earthly life on some extreme cases, and yet they're unconscious or clinically dead for minutes. So when they come back and say it's timeless, I think to at least to a first conceptualization, that means that they can have a tremendously long, elaborate, detailed experience in literally minutes of earthly life that would be equivalent roughly to, as we said, days, weeks, even in some rare cases, months. So that's a good example of radical difference of timelessness. So in that realm, when you encounter God, you could understand that it's going to be very different from what you might conceptualize physically in our earthly life. Getting back to that important question, appearance, typically described as a white light. That's the most common descriptor, but nothing like the light we know on Earth. It's often described as brilliant, having a personality. One would say, many near-death experiencers say like 1,000,000 times 1,000,000 suns, but doesn't hurt the eyes. There's no discomfort. Second most common descriptor, the overwhelming love of God. They, time and time again, the people having near-death experiences that encounter God say they're loved beyond anything they knew on Earth. They're loved completely who they are, everything that they are, with completely without judgment, which they often find incredibly reassuring. There can be communication, again, that non-physical communication. God may be present during that life review, or they encounter their prior life review, again, in a realm remarkably of non-judgment. So this is just sort of a snapshot about what near-death experience. It's about 15% described when they're either aware of or more directly actually encounter God during a near-death experience.